So you're going to be hearing from 3 of our lawyers today. You can see them on the screen already, and you can see their bios along the right-hand side of your console. They are Kelsey Becker-Brooks, Anthony Purgis, and Lauren Shelternick. And between the 3 of these folks, they have decades of experience in employment law, and I think that we're going to get a lot of value out of what they have to say. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Lauren to get us started. Go ahead, Lauren.
Great, thanks, Christine. So like Christine said today, our focus is going to be on COVID-19 vaccines in the workplace. And I think our main aim is to make sure that we're answering all of your questions, because I know that employers right now have a lot of questions about what this might look like, how they can handle it, and all of the potential issues that might come up. So some of the things that we're going to touch on today, we're going to talk about policies and what those should look like, when they should be implemented. We'll talk about what we sort of see as the big question, whether vaccines can be mandatory or not in the workplace. We'll talk about people refusing vaccines if they are mandatory, what to do during hiring and interviews, how to deal with medical records, including immunization records, and then potential liability for employers in relation to vaccines. And then, like I said, hopefully we have lots of time for questions today. So the place that we wanted to start was with policies. Our recommendation is, when it comes to something like a mandatory vaccine, if that is something that your workplace is wanting to explore, don't do it without a policy. Because you're dealing with something that is quite serious, it's quite a serious invasion of employees' privacy, and there are potential human rights implications. It's really important to have all of the parameters of a mandatory vaccine clearly set out in a policy. In order for that policy to be effective, employees must agree to it, and they must be given notice. And so this is why we're also saying it's important to prepare vaccination policies early, around now, so that when the vaccines become available, which is a bit of a moving target, but we hear could potentially be the fall, that those policies will be in place and will be ready to go, and employees will have plenty of notice in advance of that requirement being in the workplace. The other thing that should be clearly set out in a policy are the consequences of non-compliance. And so if it is a situation where an employee refuses, the policy needs to clearly set out what the consequences of refusal are, whether it be, progressive discipline measures or work from home protocols, or they're placed on a leave. And we'll talk about some of those options later on in the presentation, but that piece does need to be clearly set out. The other thing that's important with something like this that can have some significant impacts on an employer is that you make sure that you're enforcing it consistently. And again, I think as long as the policy itself is very clear, it's not ambiguous, and all of the parameters of the mandatory vaccination kind of procedure in the workplace, as long as that is all clearly set out, it will obviously be easier for an employer to then consistently enforce those provisions. The other thing with something like this is it's probably a good idea to make sure that your employees fully understand the policy, and that may require, once it's in place, a meeting with everybody and walking them through it and answering questions and making sure that they understand it. And then they do need to agree to it. And so having them sign something that indicates that they've read it, they understand it, and they're agreeing to it is necessary in this situation. So then, like I said, this is the big question about whether vaccines can be mandatory or not. And we have been getting this question a lot. And the answer is a bit of an unfortunate lawyer answer, in that the answer is yes, but it depends, and there are likely to be some exceptions that are necessary. So the easy answer is yes, but we need to kind of think about some of the potential issues that may arise and then mitigate for those issues. So the main thing that is going to dictate whether your workplace can make vaccines mandatory or not is this balance between your occupational health and safety obligations with human rights and privacy considerations. So as I'm sure you're all aware, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, you do have obligations to make sure that you have a work environment that is safe and healthy for your employees. And this is obviously something that I think has been very kind of present for employers during the pandemic. But those health and safety obligations are also highly dependent on the type of work site or the nature of the work site. So, for example, for some workplaces in the pandemic, responses to OH&S obligations included rearranging floor plans or putting physical barriers in place. Other workplaces had to update leave policies or put in new policies for when customers can visit and things like that. We've also seen employers implement temperature screening and contact tracing and things like that. So those are all suggestions that occupational health and safety has suggested in relation to addressing these health and safety obligations. And so with the vaccine can then be part of that list, but because it's such a serious invasion of an employee's privacy and bodily autonomy and their human rights, it does have to be then balanced with that as well. So a little bit more on that as well. So like I said, essentially, if you're making making vaccines mandatory in your workplace, it is a little bit like forcing somebody to get vaccinated, even if it was something that they were not necessarily considering doing. So this is a very serious invasion of privacy and can impact an employee's human rights. Specifically, and again, we'll get into this in more detail, but the two that have been, addressed kind of generally so far are medical reasons. So if somebody has a disability or some kind of medical condition that makes it, potentially higher risk to receive the vaccine, or there may be potential religious freedoms associated with vaccinations that need to just be kept in mind when considering how to implement mandatory vaccines. So again, it really goes back to this balancing exercise of health and safety obligations with these privacy and human rights considerations. And so the best way to address that balancing is to make sure that your policy clearly sets out what the legitimate health and safety purpose is for the mandatory vaccine, and making sure that the reality of making it mandatory is actually proportionate to that purpose. So, for example, we talked about how a lot of this depends on the nature of the workplace. So in a long-term care facility, the health and safety purpose is obviously way higher than, say, an office of 5 people that's large, where, those 5 people could physically distance or could wear masks or could have barriers put in place. So in an office setting like that, it may not actually be proportionate to require all of your employees to get vaccinated, whereas somewhere like a long-term care facility, I think it's quite apparent that requiring a vaccine is very proportionate to those health and safety requirements. So the way to, I guess, think through that is to think, looking at my workplace, are there any other options available to me that are not mandatory vaccines that would allow me to address my occupational health and safety obligations relating to the COVID-19 pandemic? And if there are some lesser options that you could use to address those concerns, that may be better than putting a mandatory vaccine in place. Again, it's really just a matter of assessing your workplace, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, and then determining if a mandatory vaccine is really the only way to address those obligations. So the last piece then on mandatory vaccines is the kind of yes, but part of making them mandatory, is that your policy should provide for some exemptions or exceptions. And what that should look like is some exemption provision in there that allows somebody to say, look, my doctor says it's too high risk for me to receive this vaccine for this reason. Here's a doctor's note. I am exempt from this policy, essentially. And in that situation, then employers can consider some other measures, I guess, to ensure that you're keeping your work site healthy and safe, but also ensuring that that employee's rights in relation to their medical condition are respected. And so that can look like things like unpaid leaves, again, work from home, different PPE requirements for that employee. Again, it's really going to depend on the nature of the workplace. The other thing that can potentially be helpful in relation to exemptions and exceptions is to make sure that there's a bit of a catch-all exception or exemption provision that is then in the discretion of the employer to determine whether it's appropriate or not. Because at this stage, it's hard for us to know, because obviously this has never really come up. Courts haven't considered it. The legislature hasn't considered it really. And so if employers can provide for some measure for kind of new or novel reasons that someone may legitimately be exempt, that may be appropriate to include in a policy as well. So then when it comes to exemptions and exceptions, I think the big question a lot of employers have is, so then what can I do if vaccines are mandatory and my employee refuses to get the vaccine? So for that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey.
All right, I'm unmuted. Hello to everybody out there that I know, and hello to all the people out there I don't know. I'm Kelsey Becker-Brooks. So Lauren's done a really good job of, I think, summarizing some of the things you need to think about, whether or not you're going to bring in a mandatory vaccine policy and what that policy needs to include, as far as not only exactly what is required, but also any exceptions that may be built into the policy as well. And that's really going to help you with that balancing, taking into consideration your workplace. That obviously leads to, okay, we have a rule in place. What happens if people don't follow the rule? That's always the next step. If you have an employee who refuses to get the vaccine, the steps that you can take really are going to depend on why they've refused to get the vaccine. So if you have a valid policy in place, and by valid, we want it to be clear and uncertain, it was brought in, well ahead of time so that you can address some of the issues Anthony's going to talk about later, like constructive dismissal. People are aware of the policy. People have agreed to the policy. Maybe you want to have everybody attend an information seminar and sign off on it. That's going to help you later on if somebody takes the position they didn't know about it, they didn't think it applied to them, or something like that. So assuming you have a valid employment policy in place and the person has refused to get the vaccine because of one of the exemptions that's built into it, and they're able to provide proof of the exemption, which probably should be identified in your policy as well, what's acceptable proof going to be. Maybe it's a form of a doctor's note. For religious reasons, maybe it's a statement. It's a little bit harder, I think, to get an objective verification of that when it comes to religious reasons, but generally speaking, maybe something like a statutory declaration that this is something that for religious reasons they are not comfortable with obtaining. If they can fit into one of those exemptions that's built in and they've provided the proof that's necessary, then there really isn't anything else that you can do. You've contemplated that that will occur, that there'll be a refusal in those circumstances. And what you are required to do, as Lauren touched on, is you're required to accommodate that individual then. And that accommodation is up to the point of undue hardship. And that may be that you allow them to have a different work environment or PPE, or maybe it's time, if you can't accommodate it safely some other way, maybe it's going to be unpaid time off or something like that. Or that they continue, you'll hold their position until the threat of the pandemic passes, and then they'll continue to come into the office. So, there's just so many, everyone has talked about how difficult it is to kind of continue in this atmosphere where everything is so uncertain, including timeframes and what will things look like. You got to kind of factor that in, and it may be that as time changes, what that accommodation looks like changes as well. Okay, but if the employee doesn't have a valid exemption and they still refuse to get a vaccine, then likely you're in a better position to discipline, more likely, or potentially terminate the employee. So in most cases, it's likely to be a without cause termination unless there's some special circumstances that would result in the employee's refusal to be particularly dangerous or egregious or undermining the safety of other employees or the workplace. That's where you might get into the territory of maybe terminating somebody. For cause, what you're probably going to start with, though, is some form of discipline. You have a policy in place. The policy, I'm assuming, you have a policy in place. The policy provides that what will happen if you don't comply. And there's lots of cases and situations out there which have upheld workplace rules and violations of workplace rules, giving rise to discipline under the policy. So there's still some risk, I think, that proceeding with significant discipline or termination in this case might give rise to human rights complaint. But I think the way to address that is to include alternatives to that employee as well. So either working from home, an unpaid leave of absence, those kinds of accommodation in that case are really going to take away any potential claim that they would have that their employment has been terminated as a result of their refusal to comply with the vaccine policy. But if the policy is well drafted, you're put in a pretty good position to then follow the policy as far as progressive discipline and termination with respect to that employee. There might be some room also where you could even get to the point where a refusal under the policy might lead to a just cause termination. I'm sure if you've ever called us and asked if something was just cause, short of walking up and punching your manager in the face, we almost always are going to say, well, it depends. It's in the gray area. Just cause is rarely black or white. And that's very sound legal advice because that's, pretty accurate in those circumstances. But there are cases, and there is a situation where you might get over that hurdle for just cause if the employee had a pattern of safety violations, a series of progressive discipline steps have been taken, and you've been giving them the notices that, if you keep doing this, it's going to lead to further and other discipline, up to including termination. You might get there in that circumstance with progressive discipline. And actually, in my experience, the employees who might refuse on the basis that, you can't make me do it, they are the ones who maybe potentially in the past have not been wearing a mask or pushed back or not being respectful of other people's space. And, this probably would be a culmination of those kinds of incidents. It seems to be that there are some people who just have those views of these precautions that everybody else is agreeing to follow. But your key there is going to be progressive discipline, and progressive discipline that has been documented. It's not enough to say, I talked to him. I want you to talk to him and sit him down in your office and talk to him and write him a letter and talk to him and be able to demonstrate that there's that progressive nature there. Okay. Remind me how I go ahead a slide. Oh. Nope. Can you put it at, there we go, perfect. So the next slide that I wanted to touch on is this hiring and interviews, because I think that's going to be a challenge for people as well. And it's going to, open up a bit of a can of worms where everybody else in the employed already is following these rules. It's a policy that's been brought in. How do we address this during the interview process? So during the interview process, can you ask, if the person has been vaccinated or require them to bring a vaccination proof? No, I think that is not a good idea. Generally speaking, during an interview, any questions about medical history are something that should be avoided and would potentially open you up to a human rights complaint. In the same way that when you interview people, you don't look at their finger and see, are they married and you're thinking of having kids? Those aren't the questions that are appropriate during an interview, and you really are going to open yourself up to potential liability there. So during the interview, I don't think you can ask those questions. Can you, or ask for proof? Can you ask if they're willing to be vaccinated when it becomes available? I think that probably is also discriminatory and over the line. What I do think you can do is you can make it a condition of employment, and you can have that conversation with individuals where you're going to make a conditional offer based on their merits for the position, but indicate that we do have a mandatory vaccine policy in place. So the employment offer is going to be conditional on either proof of vaccination or getting vaccinated and providing proof of vaccination unless you fall into one of the exemptions. Okay, I think there's a question there. You keep mentioning policy and a procedure be as good if they are signed with an understanding. You know, policy and procedure, I think sometimes are just, you know, different names for the same thing. I think if you're going to rely on a set of rules that you are incorporating into your workplace, probably policy is the right term to use in that case. That's, you know, a decision that's been made at the administrative level, that these are the internal rules that are going to apply to our employees. My suggestion would be to have a policy that sets out some of the matters we've discussed. Maybe you have a procedure as well that goes along with that policy that sets out these are the processes that we're going to follow as far as people confirming that they have been vaccinated. And we're going to talk about some documents as well and health records. That's something that I think could be probably dealt with in that procedure side of things. But whether you call it a policy or you call it a procedure, as long as it's brought to everybody's attention and it's very clear what the obligations are that apply to employees and what the exceptions are, I don't think a court would put too much weight in the title. You know, unless you could show all of your other workplace rules are called policies and this one isn't, then maybe there would be some argument that it shouldn't carry the same weight as other work. So a couple more questions just about, so during the interview, again, not asking about vaccination, not asking for proof of vaccination, but recognizing that you can indicate that you have this policy in place and it is going to be a condition of their employment. Okay. Again, in order to make it a condition of employment, it kind of goes back to what Lauren was talking about before, and this idea that in your workplace, is this something that is required in order to meet those OH&S requirements as far as providing a safe workplace? Let's see here. Okay, so medical records. So medical records are always a challenging one. I mean, generally, I think we want to say to employers, if you can avoid having any of those kinds of personal health records in your possession, then you are guaranteeing that you're not going to be offside on any of the pretty strict requirements when it comes to health information. But what we're talking about here is proof of health, of medical circumstances, and that does necessarily require some form of proof. So immunization records, which would be what proves that somebody has been vaccinated, do contain personal information, and that's going to trigger privacy considerations. Depending what kind of employer you are, if you're a municipality, then we're talking about under FOIP. Other bodies, we're talking about the Personal Information and Protection Act. But the key is that there's personal information which people are entitled to have privacy, and you need to make sure that you're following the applicable legislation with respect to that personal information. Provided a policy in place, I think employers are going to be permitted to request an immunization record or some other type of proof of vaccination from employees if you can meet two hurdles. You have to show that the collection of those records is reasonable in this context of managing the health and safety of the workplace, and it's necessary for the management of the employment relationship. And I think if you have followed through on the steps that we've been talking about, you're going to be able to establish that. It'll be interesting to see, again, everything's changing. The real, immunization of the majority of Albertans or Canadians has not really started ramping up yet. It'll be interesting what immunization records look like. It may be that there is some registry that develops where it's like showing a vehicle registration, or it's like showing a driver's license. Now, it contains personal health information. That makes it different. I understand that. But I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't some form of proof that develops that is something that is a very limited inclusion of private health information, because I personally am of the view that many service providers are also going to get on the bandwagon and say, you know what, you can order curbside, you can order online, but if you want to come into our store, you need to prove that you've been vaccinated. And I think Service providers are going to be looking for a way to obtain that information without worrying about all the health information implications. But that's a side note on what I think, and that doesn't mean anything. All right, so just keeping on going on, when we have that proof of vaccination, it's important when you're requesting it that you're recognizing that those privacy regulations under the applicable piece of legislation are going to apply, and also that it's health information. So the Health Information Act is also going to apply when you're collecting or using or relying on those immunization records. So if you require an immunization record, it needs to be provided by the employee directly. An employer is not authorized under the Health Information Act to request somebody's personal health number. So you can't say, give me your health number and I'll just request it. That isn't going to work. It will have to come directly from the employee, subject to some other system being set up to prove immunization. The other thing you have to make sure is what information you're requesting from them. It needs to be the minimum amount of information that is required to satisfy your objectives. So are you immunized or you're not, I think is probably the information you're entitled to. I don't think you need to know when they were immunized, where they were immunized. I suspect, we didn't talk about this. I don't think you can ask them which kind of vaccine it was that they received. Those would all be questionable if that's information that you're actually required in order to satisfy your health and safety objectives. Now, as time goes on, we may find that there is distinguishing between those, that, some are more effective than others. That may be relevant. Okay. If they refuse to provide their immunization record, well, that's just a slightly different issue than refusing to get immunized and vaccinated. But if it's in your policy, not only that they have to be vaccinated, but they have to prove to you that they are vaccinated through this method, then it's going to lead to the similar conversation that I just had earlier about refusing to get vaccinated. So if it's set out in the policy, and they refuse, and it's not a situation where an exemption applies, then the policy should set out what the consequences are going to be. Likely not going to lead to termination right off the bat, but it may be that they need to be put on an unpaid leave until the records are provided, something like that. Okay. And then keeping vaccination records, I hope they do come up with something that's really easy and doesn't contain a bunch of information, because this is going to be challenging for lots of organizations that don't normally keep any health information. Under the Health Information Act and the sensitive information it contains, there's going to be obligations to ensure it's kept in a secure location, that it's not duplicated, that it's only accessed by people who have require access to the information, that it's never disclosed. All of those obligations are going to be triggered in this circumstance as well. Okay. So let's see, there's a question here, and then I'll hand this off to Anthony. We already have a procedure in regards to COVID. It states that a copy of the test results need to be sent to us in order to receive the extra COVID days. Meetings held so everyone was made aware. Is this okay? So it sounds to me that you have adopted a policy, a procedure, a rule, something in your organization that deals with COVID and people being entitled to days off under the Employment Standards Code or under your own internal policies. Maybe there's extra time in there where somebody has tested positive for COVID and that they don't get to, that gets them extra sick days, and that they don't get to come back maybe until they have a negative test. If you have a meeting and you're able to establish this policy was brought into place, it was communicated to everybody, a copy of it was provided to everybody, we have a record of everyone who attended at the meeting on which days, that's going to put you in a strong position to then later rely on that as far as disciplinary matters or what benefits you are or are not providing to employees. So building upon that and building it into that might be a good solution, or having a separate policy is an option as well. Okay, so I think that's my section, which means I'm going to hand it off to Anthony, and he's going to bring us home.
Thanks, Kelsey. And I just to kind of, I'm sure that a lot of you have been looking at this issue and looking at different resources on this issue, and I just wanted to kind of make a couple points before I go into these slides with respect to. Because our answer, as you've seen, is as Lauren has said, is with respect to these types of policies, is a yes but answer. The only other, and there's the only one other answer that a lawyer is going to give you, which is no but. So the key point is that it's going to be in that but, in the it depends part of it. Now we've taken the position from the yes, you can have this policy, but be careful with how you implement it. In part because it's a novel situation. This isn't the flu. This isn't even comparable to some of the situations that arose with SARS. This is something that is and has been for quite some time a major public health issue, and as a result of that, the starting position that we're going from is that for a lot of workplaces, a vaccine policy is going to be considered to be a reasonable step to take to protect the health and safety of your employees, and that if it's not done, that you risk creating a safety issue. I want to pause, because Kelsey had given the example for a cause termination of someone punching someone in the face. And there was actually a case out of Ontario about 5 years ago where one employee punched another employee in the face, was terminated for cause, and the court said that wasn't cause. So even just to show you how high the threshold is for cause, which is, as Kelsey said, there may be circumstances where there's a vaccine refusal that may be cause, but it has to be read in the entire context of the employment relationship. And that context is what I want to talk about, for the first kind of potential liability issue that arises for employers when talking about mandatory vaccine policies. And first is this notion of constructive dismissal. So the concept of constructive dismissal, some of you are aware of it, some of you aren't, is a situation where an employer unilaterally, so on its own, imposes a new condition of employment on the employee that the employee has to follow, changes something to the employment agreement. That's fundamental. So this isn't a matter of, okay, we're changing the dress code to no longer allow capris. This is, is it something fundamental? Arguably, and I think there's a good argument, is that requiring employees to get a vaccine, which is, as Lauren has said, legally is considered very invasive and very personal, that would be considered a substantial, that would be a substantial change to the employment agreement. So the first thing you want to look at before putting this policy in place is, what do your current policies already say? What do your current agreements already say? What does the collective agreement, if you have a union shop, already say? Is there some flexibility in those documents that you can argue and say, okay, well, this allows us to put in certain policies, for protecting the health and safety of, our employees, or for protecting the public, or for protecting others. And then if not, that doesn't mean you can't put this into place, but then you need to really think about what, the scope of invasiveness and the details of the policy. And this actually allows me to kind of bring in the question that came in that was asked is, if you don't make it mandatory, can you offer incentive money or a day off if an employee proves that they get vaccinated? So in other words, if I understand the question correctly, instead of requiring the employee to get, instead of the stick, you use a carrot. So instead of requiring the employee to get vaccinated, you say, look, if you get vaccinated, we'll give you an incentive to do so. And you can certainly set up a policy like that. The only thing that needs to be, one of the things that needs to be considered with respect to that, though, is why is it being set up that way? And what I mean by that is, I'm going to talk a bit in a few slides about, for example, negligence. But one of the issues that employers have to grapple with is, what's going to happen if we don't have a policy? If we don't require our employees to get vaccinated, and someone someone catches COVID as a result, someone who can't get vaccinated, for example, and they come to and they come there, or they get exposed, and it's found that you didn't require your employees to get vaccinated, and they caught COVID from one of your employees. What kind of liability are you courting? Is it worth that risk? So and that's what you have to determine, whether, okay, are we going to do the carrot vaccination policy, which says we would like our employees to get vaccinated, but if they don't, we can actually continue operating with these safety measures in place, and the safety measures may be more working from home, things like that, or do we need to? Are we exposing ourselves to risk by not requiring a mandatory policy? And so, coming back to this issue of constructive dismissal, then. Constructive dismissal arises, as said, there's a certain risk that comes when you're imposing vaccination policy. The employee can say, essentially, for constructive dismissal, that's not the job I signed up for. So that's the same as firing me. That's why it's called constructive dismissal, because you're not actually firing them, but the change is the same. The easiest way to avoid a constructive dismissal claim is to give ample amounts of notice that you're going to make a change, because all employees are entitled to reasonable notice or some notice or contractual notice of termination at law. So with any employee, you can fundamentally change their agreement. And if you give them enough notice, then their option is to say, okay, I'm treating that as working notice, and you've fired me, and I'll be gone when the policy takes effect, or they have to accept the policy. And if they continue working, they're deemed to have agreed and acquiesced to it, as long as you give enough notice. And so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this seminar in the early stages, really before there's been a lot of actual legal developments on the idea of mandatory vaccine policies, because if you can get your mandatory vaccination policy out now, before kind of the August-September timeline that the province has been talking about, where vaccines are going to be available for the majority of non-healthcare workers, then you've given a lot of notice and you've avoided a lot of the risk of a constructive dismissal claim. You can advise the employees, okay, this is coming, and that gives them an opportunity to raise concerns, to say they're not going to agree to that. But if you give substantial notice on that, that gives a significant advantage as to whether to put this policy in place. In terms of how much notice is acceptable, that really depends on each individual employee. And what I mean by that is it's the same factors that go into reasonable notice of termination. And so how long the employee's been there, their position, whether their contract sets out any amount of notice. In an ideal world, no matter how long your employees have been there, if you can give them about 12 to 18 months notice, that would be ideal. That's not going to happen in this case, right? Where some long-term care facilities are going to be dealing with vaccines, they're for their employees sooner than other employers are. But I would suggest that you're still in a pretty safe zone with most of your employees, even with the kind of 6 to 7 months that we're likely currently looking at. Because there's a flip side to the constructive dismissal aspect that we didn't deal with on this slide, but is also to keep in mind, again, in terms of whether you incorporate a policy or not, is if you don't have mandatory vaccination, are you going to have employees that don't feel safe? Because an employer has an obligation to provide a safe workplace for their employees. And if you have an individual who is concerned that the other employees they work with aren't vaccinated, they may raise a concern that that's an unsafe work environment. That might be a complaint to occupational health safety, but that could also in itself be a constructive dismissal claim. And we see that in cases of harassment where someone feels that they're being harassed or bullied and the employer isn't dealing with it. And so they say that I've been harassed and, I've been constructively dismissed. And with respect to whether anyone doesn't agree to the policy, this type of policy is the same as this type of policy is the same as any other type of policy, which is as long as it is reasonable for the circumstances of the workplace, then it's the employee's duty to follow any reasonable rule the employer sets. And so if they don't agree, when I say don't agree, I'll talk about human rights again in a minute. That's not referencing they don't agree because they have a medical exemption or something like that. If they don't agree because they don't like the policy, that won't be sufficient. It won't be sufficient to avoid a constructive dismissal claim, and it won't be sufficient as I move on with respect to a human rights issue. For example, there was a case, I was going to reference it later, but I'll talk about it now, where it was out of Ontario, where there was a requirement for ambulance drivers to get the influenza vaccine. One ambulance driver said that they didn't want the influenza vaccine, and they listed a number of medical considerations. They said they didn't think it was effective. They didn't think it was necessary. And what the Human Rights Commission in Ontario said in that case is they said those are medical considerations. That's your opinion, employee, but that's not a human rights ground. That's not a protected ground that allows you to refuse the vaccine in that case. And likewise, as Lauren said, there are some circumstances where a mandatory vaccine can be a human rights violation for religious reasons. Although, and it's important to note that the protection under the Human Rights Act with respect to religion is based on the person having a sincerely held belief in that particular creed. So just because 99% of the of people of a certain religion that are actually okay with vaccination doesn't necessarily mean that this individual doesn't sincerely believe that vaccination in their case is contrary to their understanding, their sincerely held belief. So the most important thing to take away from any of these exemptions and any human rights issues is anytime anyone is raising a concern with the policy or is refusing to get a vaccine, it's worth finding out why. So there's a question about being proactive and polling the employees to determine their thoughts on mandatory vaccination in the workplace. I don't see a problem with that. One of the advantages of that is that lets you get in front of or make sure your policy is drafted to account for potential human rights issues that may be that may be novel or within your workplace, or it lets you get in front of the accommodation issue, because there are employers do have a number of defenses to any potential discrimination claim. I should say, and Lauren already mentioned this, the other ground that a mandatory vaccine policy potentially impacts on the human rights is if someone has medical disability or something like that. And you are able, the way the Human Rights Act is worded, is that there is such a thing as reasonable and justifiable discrimination. So it's still discrimination. It's still discrimination saying you have to get this vaccine or you can't come to work. And if you can't come to work because of a medical condition, well, they're being discriminated against. But there's reasonable and justifiable discrimination is allowed under the Human Rights Act, but that has to be based on the workplace needs. It has to be based on the the particular workplace in question. You cannot assume that a policy that applies to that would apply great to a long-term care facility is the same policy that makes sense for example, a law office. Our office's COVID policy is very short and to the point. We have a very spread out scenario. Lots of people are able to work from home. It's a relatively simple one that accounts for our workplace requirements. It wouldn't make sense for our policy to be used by a long-term care facility or a public works or warehouse situation where there's lots of people in each other's space type of thing. So the main point and the main thing to consider when you're considering a policy is that policy reasonably necessary to address the concern? And while you're considering the policy, one of the things that has to be contemplated is it a bona fide occupational requirement? And the test for that, one of the key components of it is that standard, is that requirement reasonably necessary to accomplish whatever the workplace purpose is? So this is going to be something that's going to come up because one of the points of pushback to any mandatory vaccine policy is going to be, well, we've continued to function without a vaccine policy in place. I've been able to work from home, so why do I need to get a vaccine? I shouldn't have to come in. And that's going to have to those types of considerations are going to have to be considered. Is there, will it be sufficient to have individuals in masks? Or will that be creating too much of a risk? Will that be creating a risk for other employees, other employers? Oh, one thing I wanted to mention before I go on from the human rights, because one of the things to keep in mind as well is when we're talking about potential liability, what are we really talking about? So when we're talking about constructive dismissal, the scope of damages we're looking at are potential, the same damages an employee would get on a wrongful dismissal action. So their reasonable notice or their notice requirement is a potential. So for some outlier cases, that could be as much as 2 years of salary. But it's often lower than that, but still it could be a substantial amount. When we're talking about a potential human rights complaint, what are the possible, what's the possible liability? What's the scope? Well, from a personal perspective, there's injury to dignity damages, which is often in the range of $25,000 and up. There is make whole requirements, such as requiring you to amend your policy to get education on a particular amount. Could be a requirement to reinstate an employee if they were terminated as a result of following a policy that the Human Rights Commission found to be discriminatory. And so I want to kind of address that question that came in about policy versus procedure. And the biggest distinction between the two, of course, is policy is the why, procedure is the how. And when you're dealing with a human rights, establishing a rule or a policy that may be subject to a human rights complaint, you need to show that you've done the work on the why. Why do we have this policy, or why do we have this, even if it's just a procedure? Why is it in place? So, I think I agree with Kelsey that for the most part, there would at least be some sort of overlapping policy, because someone needs to have a serious discussion on the why. And you don't want to put it in place just to have it. There will be pushback on these. There's actually an excellent question just came in regarding, could we make the policy specific to specific groups of employees? Example, those are external client facing or spend the majority of time attending events with external people. And that is absolutely right. And that's what I mean about the why, is you look at your whole workforce and you say, well, we don't actually need, it's not essential to our functioning that this group be, that this group be vaccinated. But if we have people dealing with the public, that's a huge risk. A member of the public comes in, catches COVID because one of your employees came sick and they were sick with COVID because with enough vaccination, maybe some of the public health measures come down, and then it's found out that you didn't take a reasonable precaution of making sure anyone who's contacting the public has been vaccinated. That creates a risk, and so you have to look and say, okay, we need mandatory vaccination for this position. We can do some sort of incentive plan for this position, or we don't need these people to be vaccinated. The third area of potential liability that's going to come up with these vaccine policies is in negligence, and we focused on the slide here. I've made some comments on kind of the other way and the risk to employers if they don't put a policy in place and an infection arises from that. But then we go to, but going the other way, is there a risk that there's a negligence complaint as against the employer if we require employees to get the vaccine and they have a bad reaction? Short answer is if the vaccine is required, it's almost certain that it would be a WCB compensable injury. Previous cases, with respect to other vaccines, there was in BC, it was found that allergic reactions to immunizations would be compensable if they were required by the employer. And then there's also a case out of Ontario where a nurse had adverse reactions to the H1N1 vaccine. And again, it was found there that would be compensable. Alberta's WCB hasn't given a policy statement yet. And in terms of what WCB's position has been with respect to a COVID infection, for example, and this is, there's a question of how can they prove that the public person got the COVID from one of our employees, and that's certainly the issue that WCB is looking at, even with respect to compensable claims. Is right now WCB won't compensate employees for COVID unless there's been an outbreak at that facility or they're an essential worker, essentially. So long-term care or medical profession or something like that. Otherwise, it might be difficult to prove. However, once vaccines become more predominant, if someone can't get the vaccine and then they can show that everyone they encountered that day had been vaccinated or they hadn't encountered anyone else, and then they get it from somebody, it's possible. Those are the types of cases that, frankly, keep Kelsey, Lauren, and I very busy for long periods of time. This is one of those situations, as with any policy, where a bit of time and a bit of effort up front may save a lot of cost and headaches into the future. So as I think, as I mentioned, with respect to some of our takeaways, and there are a couple of other questions, and I will get to those. I just haven't had a chance to read them while I'm talking. But some of the takeaways that we want to make, sure that you get from this is that you really need to do the thinking with respect to a vaccination policy now. It is, for a lot of workplaces, it is going to be more of a policy decision in terms of looking at what risk does this create, if we have one, if we don't have one, and are we willing to live with that risk. For some workplaces, long-term care facilities, medical facilities, there was a recent arbitration case out of Ontario where it was challenged about requiring people to get COVID tests before going back to work, and that was unsuccessful, meaning that the employer was allowed to require that. I think the same logic, so far from what we've seen in the courts and the arbitrators, is they are treating COVID seriously as a serious risk to health and safety in the workplace, and they are going to look for certain measures to be taken. So then when you're putting together your policy, the policy has to be reasonable, and it has to be clear, and it has to, like I said, consider certain situations that may arise. So there's a question, for example, about mandatory masks, and can we require someone who doesn't get vaccinated to do mandatory mask? And the short answer is yes. It's because it's a safety issue. And so if someone is refused to get vaccinated, and you think that there is a safety risk as a result of them being in the workplace, then you can require better PPE, either a mask or some sort of divider, something to keep take reasonable steps to maintain health and safety in the workplace. And likewise with the policy, because there's a question about having waivers, as an option for those who disagree in receiving a vaccination. And the issue you're going to have to do and consider with any vaccination policy is, waivers can be included, but the issue is less the person refusing the vaccine and the risk to them, because if they're your employee, they'll, like I said, if they get it at the workplace, there's a possible chance they'll be covered by WCB, but they can't sign a waiver for their health and safety, and so with respect to you can't have an employee sign a waiver that says, employer, you can whatever physical harm happens to me in the workplace, I waive you of liability for that. I mean, that's partially why the WCB system is in place to avoid that. So in terms of what you put in your policy, it's great to see that people are thinking of these possibilities and these outcomes, because there are a lot of different scenarios that should be contemplated, and they are going to be unique and specific to your individual workplace. I see that there's another question in the box, but I do also note the time, so I want to kind of pass it along to Christine, and we may come back to one or two questions if we have some extra time. But before I do that, I do want to thank all of you for attending, for your attention, and for the clear thought and focus you're bringing to this issue. I think it's going to be a crucial issue in the coming months, and I also think it's one that is going to be we're going to get a lot of developments, and we're going to unfortunately be learning a lot as these situations arise.